And we are back with David Sanger and Vali Nasser. David, ever since the start of this Israeli war with Hamas in Gaza, President Biden has faced a tough challenge, which is he wants to show unwavering, unqualified support for Israel, and yet he has had deep reservations about Bibi Netanyahu's war strategy, urging him to be more restrained, more targeted, to be careful not to escalate. My understanding, and there's some reporting on this, that they counseled the Israelis against the kind of escalation that involved the attack on Iran's facilities, consular facilities in Damascus. Where does that relationship stand, and will Biden, you think, be able to have any influence on Israeli policy, which so far he seems to have had limited influence?
That's right, Fareed. I mean, I would say that Biden has been extraordinarily frustrated in his dealings with Bibi Netanyahu, in part because every time that he has gone to counsel some form of advice that Israel was not acting in its long-term interests, that it needed to allow in more aid, that it needed to put off certain military strikes, that it needed to stop using 2,000-pound bombs in crowded urban areas, he was basically ignored. And just before this incident unfolded, of course, you saw Biden hit a breaking point, one in which he said, if you don't follow our advice, including on not attacking in Rafah, this could require a broad rethinking of the relationship. So the breach was pretty open. The question now is, does it remain that way, or can he use this as a turning point, since it was the U.S. that was there helping intercept missiles last night? One of the big questions is, who else can he bring into this? He's meeting the G7 today, but missing in that, Fareed, are the two countries that have the most influence with Iran, Russia and China. And, I argue in New Cold Wars, but we've also discussed at other moments that the defining issue in this particular moment is that at this point, the allies who sat, or the countries that sat with the U.S. to try to restrain Iran and its nuclear program 7, 8, 9 years ago, have now flipped over to the other side. And Iran and Russia are part of the so-called axis of resistance.
Vali, I noticed that Washington asked China to restrain Iran. Washington has no influence with Russia. But do China and Russia, they do seem to act, broadly speaking, in concert, in the sense that, as David says, they are all opposed to the kind of American-led world order and Middle Eastern balance of power. But does Russia or China have influence with Iran?
I mean, the short answer is yes, they have much more influence with Iran now than, say, Europeans or the United States has. But as David points out in his excellent book, this brewing Cold War between U.S., China, and Russia now becomes much more complicated when you actually need their help in something with Iran. They may have their own interests why they don't want a war with the Middle East, but they're not just going to be letter carriers for Washington without sort of being engaged on also issues that matters to them. And also the difference with Gaza and what's happening with Iran is that the U.S. influence with Israel was about how Israel handled the war and what it meant for global public opinion or domestic public opinion. But the escalation with Iran could potentially actually get the United States into a war. And that really does feature on China and Russia's own calculations when they themselves are at odds with the United States. So the U.S. has to have a much more comprehensive view of these sets of global relations and think in terms of the Middle East as part of that global rivalry with Russia and China.
David, as you point out in your book, it really is a sea change from 10 years ago. Obama administration, Russia and China were effectively allied with the United States in putting sanctions on Iran, then the Iran nuclear deal, in which all the Security Council major powers joined together, and now here you have Russia and China as part of the axis of resistance. You touch on this in your book. Henry Kissinger always felt that one of the core goals of American foreign policy should be to avoid Russia and China forming an alliance, to kind of heighten the divisions between Russia and China. Do you think that that is still a strategy left for the U.S.? I mean, is there a way, and it would really be to wean China, to have a better working relationship with China and wean it off its unqualified support for Russia?
It's the sort of defining question of this time, Fareed, and I'm glad you raised it, because Kissinger's idea, by doing the opening to China, and Nixon's, of course, was to create that division, and it worked for 60 or more years. What's happened now is that we missed, to some degree, Russia's move toward authoritarianism, and we failed to understand that it would be taking over territory. We made a parallel mistake with China, and then we were pretty slow to recognize the degree to which they were coming together. Putin and Xi have met more than 40 times. President Biden has met Putin one time in his time in office, and that will probably be the last one. So we're at a moment right now where the strategy we need to look at is, how do you contain the worst aspects of their behavior, but also prevent them from working together? And that's the new mission in Washington. And so far, I would have to say, we are not very far down that road in developing that strategy.
Vali, very quickly before we go, I got to ask you, Iran is also in the midst of a kind of leadership change, right? I mean, there's talk about what happens after the supreme leader, who is the longest serving, I think, leader in the world right now. What happens after he goes? Unfortunately, you have 30 seconds, but give us a quick preview of what's happening.
Well, it's going to be definitely a big change for Iran. Anytime a leader of that long duration leaves, there's going to be change. But more key is that all Iranians, including the supreme leader, are aware of it. And I think at this point in time, he prefers stability rather than tumult in regional issues, domestic issues, because the succession goes much better if Iran is not at war with Israel or the United States and is in a much better position. That does give an opening to the West, if you would, to try to manage relations with Iran.
Vali Nasser, David Sanger, very smart analysis. Thank you so much.